the person who committed these crimes is in amongst our society, or was at the time of them. So he was associating with people, more than likely held a job down. So there is someone out there who has got information, we think, that hasn't been passed on.
My prediction is, of course, that he will continue to offend until he's apprehended, and that the frequency of his offending will increase.
I don't think Victoria's ever going to forget this series of crimes that were that horrendous.
August 22nd, 1987. On the outskirts of Melbourne, Australia, specifically in the suburban area of Lower Plenty, things are as they should be. While the rest of the world is beginning to cool down for fall, winter is just coming to an end in Australia, so temperatures are still relatively chilly in this southern city. It is around 4 a.m. on a Saturday, the time where most families are at home, fast asleep. But on this chosen morning, an urban legend is beginning to take form, in the shape of a masked man lurking outside of a family home. Removing a pane from the family's living room window, this criminal made his way inside, alerting absolutely no one. This masked man made his way to the bedroom of the parents, armed with a knife and a gun. He woke up both parents, under the threat of lethal retaliation, pretending to be just a common thief that was interested in their personal belongings. Commanding the parents to roll over onto their stomachs, this criminal tied both of their hands and feet together, nullifying any plan of escape the two may have had in their tired, groggy, yet thoroughly alarmed state. This intruder utilized a type of knot commonly used by sailors or those with nautical experience. To further compound their inability to escape, the masked man ordered them into their nearby wardrobe, but not before blindfolding and gagging each of them with surgical tape that he had brought with him. He locked both parents in their closet, under the threat of death, and made his way to the rest of the house. In an adjacent bedroom, the family's 6-year-old son was awoken by the intruder, but was kept relatively unharmed. The masked man blindfolded and gagged the boy with the same surgical tape, and then tied him to his own bed. This was when the intruder made his true purpose known, and he made his way into the nearby bedroom of the family's 11-year-old daughter. Over the next 2 hours, this masked intruder would take breaks from his own perverted sexual desires to wander throughout this family's home, even stopping at one point to make himself a meal. After spending the better part of 2 hours sexually assaulting this poor 11-year-old girl, this mysterious psychopath left the house with a box of classic records and a blue jacket stolen from the family. This is how the legend of Mr. Cruel began, and established an Australian boogeyman that would haunt parents and children for decades afterwards. Welcome to the Unresolved podcast. I'm your host, Micheal Whelan, and this is our first official episode of 2016. If you are new to the podcast, then I would like to thank you for listening and let you know a little bit about it. This is a podcast all about unsolved mysteries and stories that are unresolved in nature, stories that have no clear-cut ending and potentially leave more questions than answers. For this episode of the Unresolved podcast, I will of course be looking at the story of Mr. Cruel, a notorious criminal who committed crimes in Australia in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and has become an urban legend to thousands, if not millions, of Australians in the Victoria area in the years since. This is the type of story that would make any parent nauseous, as even the minor details lift the veil on a criminal willing to commit heinous crimes to the most innocent victims imaginable: children. So without waiting any longer, here we go, into the tale of the Australian boogeyman known as Mr. Cruel. Following the attack on the family in Lower Plenty, the police were obviously called and brought in to investigate the crime. Without a doubt, they were stumped. This attack seemed to come unprovoked, as the family had no real demons to look into. The crime didn't seem to fit with any of the other open cases in the area either. In the late 1980s, Melbourne had the reputation of being a safe place. The most livable city in the world, many citizens ascribed as its unofficial slogan. So, police began to look into the assault and pick apart the pieces. The parents had been bound, gagged, and then locked inside their own wardrobe. The son had been bound, gagged, blindfolded, and then tied to his own bed. The daughter had been sexually assaulted over the span of a couple of hours, in which the suspect searched the house and eventually made off with a record collection and, randomly, a coat. More details came out when the investigators began to focus on the daughter, and she told the police that during one of the perpetrator's breaks, he had used the family phone to call someone else. This call was a threat, as apparently the man had demanded the person on the other end of the phone to move their own children, or else they would be next, and he referred to this person as Bozo. When the police checked the family's phone records, they were surprised to see that no such call had actually taken place. Obviously, this was before the commonplace nature of cell phones, but it became clear later on that this was a trend of Mr. Cruel. He liked to plant red herrings like this, to confuse the investigators. Fortunately, it would be over a year before the perpetrator struck again. But unfortunately, we would see the stakes rise dramatically as this perverted individual began a reign of terror that would leave parents and children alike living in fear. December 27th, 1988. Just days after Christmas, most families would still be enjoying the post-holiday bliss. But on this day, one family would experience the most traumatic, haunting experience of their lives. John Wills, his wife, and his 4 daughters were sleeping in their Ringwood area home, just a few miles southeast of where the previous assault had taken place over a year prior. John was deep asleep, when at around 5:45 in the morning, the sensation of an object to his temple startled him awake. "Don't be a hero," a voice ordered him, and John was immediately plunged into a parent's worst nightmare. This masked intruder, wearing dark blue overalls and a blue ski mask, was holding a gun to John's head. He was holding a knife in his other hand, and John knew that to fight back would be to risk the lives of his entire family. John and his wife were both ordered to roll onto their stomachs, much like the first crime, and they were bound at their wrist and ankles with copper wire. A similar type of knot was utilized as before, a specialized one used primarily by sailors. They were then blindfolded and gagged with the same type of surgical tape as before, and were then assured by the intruder that he was only there for money. Living up to his word, the masked man stole roughly $35 from the family's bedside table, and he then went throughout the house, physically cutting the home's phone lines. After ensuring that he had a head start, he made his way to the bedroom that the family's 4 daughters shared. Addressing 10-year-old Sharon Wills by name, this man woke up the groggy 10-year-old girl, and then proceeded to blindfold and gag her as he had her parents. He stopped to pick up a few items of her clothing, and then made off with her into the early morning. It took roughly 15 minutes for the 2 parents to break free of their restraints, and when they finally did, they were confronted with the crippling realization that their oldest daughter was missing. With the phone lines cut, John had to rush next door to the neighbor's house to use their telephone, and he then proceeded to search the neighborhood in a panicked state. Unfortunately, his search would be in vain and come up with nothing. 10-year-old Sharon Wills was gone, and this family's nightmare had just begun. For over 18 hours, the Wills family existed in a panicked state, worrying that their 10-year-old daughter had been taken from them for good. It was just after midnight when a woman stumbled upon a small figure standing on a street corner. Wrapped up in green garbage bags, the small figure was Sharon Wills, as she had been left by her abductor. Despite the terrible trauma that had just befallen her, the 10-year-old girl was in surprisingly strong spirits, calm and collected. "My name is Sharon Wills," she told the woman, "and I was just taken from home early this morning. A man left me here and told me to go and ring home." The woman that found her called police and got in touch with the Wills family, and soon they were all reunited.
"To have your daughter taken and not know where she is indescribable. She's a brave little trooper."
But the investigation into the assault was just beginning, and it turned up some surprising evidence, or rather, the lack of any. Sharon was blindfolded throughout the entire ordeal, so she wasn't able to give a physical description of the attacker. But she described him as a soft-spoken, rather blunt individual that actually seemed somewhat caring about his victims. This, of course, stood in stark contrast to the egregious crimes that had just taken place, so investigators were sure to take a note of it. One of the words used to describe him was gentle, which was especially shocking. During her brief captivity, Sharon was apparently fed a Vegemite sandwich and given some milk and lemonade to drink. And shortly before being let go, the suspect had given the 10-year-old girl a thorough cleaning, not only washing off any possible forensic evidence he had left behind, but clipping her fingernails and toenails, brushing and flossing her teeth, washing her hair, and more. The abductor either kept or discarded her clothes, not wanting any forensic evidence to be traced back to him. He then dressed her in an assortment of garbage bags before dumping her off on the grounds of Baywater High School, just a few miles away from her house. Investigators were quick to piece this incident to the prior one in Lower Plenty, but they wouldn't make details of that public for quite some time. Needless to say, though, an environment of fear was beginning to take shape, and the nickname of the Hampton Rapist began to be used to describe this burgeoning boogeyman. In the weeks and months following the assault, the Wills family lived in a state of fear. The parents, along with their 4 daughters, began to sleep in the family's lounge together, refusing to sleep in separate bedrooms for months. They installed a security system, and were even given a golden retriever as a pet by a caring individual. John Wills, in particular, took the assault very difficultly. He began to wonder if anything he might have done would have changed the course of the assault, or saved his daughter all of that untold pain. He had no way to know, and simply had to hedge his bets on the police eventually finding his daughter's abductor. Unfortunately, the investigation into finding the perpetrator was a dead end. Very little evidence was left behind or ever found, and none of it could be used to find one specific person. One piece of evidence was emerged in later interviews, in which Sharon told of hearing low-flying aircraft during her short captivity. This is a clue that would go on to affect the investigation later on, for better or worse. While many in the area began to wonder who this masked menace was, another frightening question began to emerge. Who was next? Nearly 2 years would pass before that question would be answered. The area of Canterbury, Victoria, lies just on the outskirts of Melbourne. Located west of Ringwood and south of Lower Plenty, it is yet another part of the sprawling suburban area, albeit much closer to the center of Melbourne proper. The Linus family were rather well-off English citizens, who had been renting a house along the esteemed, prestigious Monomeath Avenue. For context, this neighborhood had been home to many Australian politicians and public officials. Moving to Australia for business and career purposes, the family was prepared to move back to England in the very near future. In fact, they had moved to this Melbourne area community specifically to raise their children safely, and were planning on making their move back home to England just days later. On July 3rd, 1990, their illusion of Melbourne's safety would be shattered forever. The Linus parents, Brian and Rosemary, were at a farewell party being thrown for them. The family was planning on moving back to England just the next week, so they left their 2 daughters alone at home for just a few hours. It was shortly before midnight when 15-year-old Fiona and 13-year-old Nicola were awoken by the angry, commanding barks of a masked intruder. He ordered Nicola into another room to collect her school uniform from the Presbyterian Ladies' College she attended, while he began to tie up Fiona in the very bed she had just been sleeping in. Facing an intruder with a gun and a knife, these 2 lone teenage girls stood no chance of either fight or flight. And now, with the oldest of the 2 bound, this intruder was able to make his getaway quite easily. Informing Fiona that her father, Brian, would have to pay $25,000 for the safe return of Nicola, this intruder took her and made his escape in the family's own rental car, which was parked in their driveway. The 2 drove for about a kilometer, and then they proceeded to park the family's rental car and presumably transfer to another parked car that this abductor had prepared. It was just 20 minutes after the abduction that Brian and Rosemary Linus returned home, finding their driveway empty and their front door open. That intrigue turned to fear, which only compounded when they found poor 15-year-old Fiona bound on her own bed with a ransom message to share. The police found almost no evidence from the crime scene itself, the intruder's kidnapping of Nicola having been done in a quick, tactical manner. They realized the tough spot that they were now put in, with most missing person cases going cold just hours after the initial abduction. Unlike the abduction of Sharon Wills, Nicola wasn't returned later that day, or even the next day. Roughly 36 hours after the abduction, her father Brian held a press conference in which he pleaded with the abductor and stated his willingness to comply with the ransom demands in any way possible. Unfortunately, the Hampton rapist, as he was now known as, had left behind only a demand for money, but no means of which to collect. The investigation began to look into business dealings of Brian, beginning to think that this may somehow be related to his work. Fortunately for poor Nicola and her family, she was found alive approximately 50 hours after being abducted. It was her 14th birthday. Found outside an electricity station in Kew, just a short distance away from her home, Nicola was left by her abductor, fully dressed and wrapped in a blanket. Her abductor had left her outside the utility station and told her to sit in a prone position until he could drive away. After that, she had removed the blindfold that she had been wearing for the better part of 50 hours, and then made her way to a nearby house. Nicola was able to provide the investigators with some details that were vital to their investigation. Most prominent among them was a rough estimation of the perpetrator's height, which was roughly 175 centimeters, or 5'8" for those of us stateside. She had guessed this by judging her own height to the attacker when he rushed her from the bedroom to the getaway car, and said that he barely stood taller than herself. She also revealed that the suspect likely had reddish-brown hair. Nicola was also able to give detectives some vital details they hadn't heard as of yet. A description of her abductor's house and vehicle. While the sketches she gave the police were rather mundane and plain in nature, they were of vital importance. Apparently Nicola had been blindfolded for the duration of her captivity, but had been given a few chances to get a glimpse of her surroundings, and she had taken it. This went in direct contrast to threats given to her by Mr. Cruel. "My freedom is worth more than your life," he had told Nicola, which echoed threats he had given to Sharon Wills. Just like Sharon's captivity, Nicola had been bathed and cleaned before her release. During this endeavor, it was reported that the perpetrator talked aloud to another person while Nicola was blindfolded in a bedroom, but no response was ever heard. Investigators weren't sure whether this meant there was an accomplice or such, but it's likely that this was just one of his many red herrings. She also told investigators, months after the Linus family completed their move back home to their native England, that she remembered hearing the same type of low-flying aircraft previously reported by Sharon. To investigators, this meant that the suspect lived in the surrounding vicinity of the nearby Tullamarine Airport, most likely in its direct flight path. Now the investigators had the rough height of the victim, as well as detailed sketches of his house, the interior of his car, and a good idea of where he lived. You'd assume that a warrant would be issued for an arrest any day now, but you'd be assuming wrong. Unfortunately, the worst was yet to come. John and Phyllis Chan were two incredibly hardworking parents that worked approximately 18 hours a day to ensure luxurious lives for their 3 daughters. Both of them immigrants to Australia, the two parents owned 3 restaurants in the Eltham area of Victoria, as well as a handful of other property investments. The two parents often didn't return home until midnight or so, managing one of their 3 restaurants. They would often leave their 3 daughters home alone, trusting their 13-year-old daughter Carmen to watch over the other 2. Mr. Cruel must have known this, as detectives believe he would stake out his victims for weeks or months ahead of time, learning their habits. On April 13th, 1991, terror and tragedy would strike the Chan family, in the form of Mr. Cruel himself. Even though the family resided in the comfortable Templestowe district of Victoria, in a house that many would classify as a mansion, they weren't immune to the dread of Mr. Cruel. It was a Saturday, normally a very busy day for the Chan parents. Carmen and her 2 younger sisters were left to their own devices, which on a Saturday night meant the 3 sisters would be watching movies or TV in Carmen's bedroom. At roughly 8:40 in the evening, Carmen and one of her sisters started to go to the family's kitchen to make something to eat. In the hallway, they were confronted by Mr. Cruel, wearing his traditional balaclava, along with a green-gray tracksuit, and holding a knife. "I only want your money," Mr. Cruel told the 3 girls, as he forced the 2 younger daughters into Carmen's closet. He claimed that he only wanted Carmen to show him where the money was, and he braced a bed in front of the closet, locking in the 2 youngest daughters as he made his getaway with Carmen. Within minutes, Carmen's 2 younger sisters had broken free from their makeshift prison, and they immediately placed a call to their father, hard at work at the family restaurant. By the time police arrived, they knew what had taken place. The large house had no sign of children within. No yard toys, no playground equipment, or anything of the sort. This attack had been planned, and that was evident from the house's driveway. Written in big bold letters on Phyllis Chan's parked Toyota Camry were the words, "Payback, Asian drug dealer. More to come." Tracing his entrance from a cut window screen, police were able to track the intruder's steps throughout the house, including his getaway through the sliding glass door in the kitchen. Aided by tracking dogs, they were able to trace the abductor's steps through the family's garden and tennis court, up to nearly 300 meters away at a vacant lot, where he must have made his getaway with Carmen at a waiting car. Hoping to get their daughter returned home safely to them, both John and Phyllis Chan held a press conference roughly 72 hours later.
"Carmen, look, this is your favorite dress. You wear every day. Last Saturday, you left at home. You have to come home and wear it. The coat's waiting for you. You love the coat very much. Carmen, your sister needs you. Don't spoil my family, please. Take my daughter home safe.
Phyllis Chan broke down sobbing, holding up the outfit Carmen had been wearing the night she was taken, and pleading for her daughter to be returned home safely.
She loved her sister very much, and her mom, and then dad.
Days later, the Chan family posted an encrypted letter in the local newspaper, using a cipher that Carmen would have been able to solve. They offered ransom in exchange for the safe return of their daughter. Even Carmen's sisters penned letters to be published in the media, begging for their older sister to be returned to help take care of them and help them with their homework. Unfortunately, days, weeks, and then months would pass with no word on Carmen's safe return. And more unfortunately, the investigation was marred from the very beginning. The first police responders spoiled any potential evidence by failing to establish the Chan house as a crime scene. There were dozens of untrained police walking throughout the house and looking for leads, before investigators could begin to look for clues of their own. Even though the police force spent the next few months running a fine-tooth comb through John Chan's personal and professional life, looking for any possibility of criminal ties or business enemies, the investigation soon swung to focus on Mr. Cruel. Investigators believed that the writing on the Chan's vehicle was nothing more than another red herring, meant solely to mislead investigators. Starting one of the largest manhunts in Australian history, Operation Spectrum was a multi-million-dollar undertaking that consumed tens of thousands of man-hours, along with many thousands of more volunteer hours. Offering a $300,000 reward for any information leading to the capture of Mr. Cruel, a reward that still stands today. The safe return of Carmen Chan was of the utmost priority. However, there would be no happy ending for Carmen or her family. Nearly a year to the day of Carmen's abduction, on April 9th, 1992, a man was walking his dog in the nearby area of Thomastown, along Edgar's Creek, when the pair stumbled upon a weird object. Returning home to alert the authorities, the police soon discovered what the man had found: a fully decomposed skeleton, which would soon be revealed to have been Carmen Chan. An autopsy would reveal that Carmen had been shot 3 times in the head, execution style, and based on the decomposition of her skeleton, had likely been dead for close to a year. Theories have lingered as to why Mr. Cruel murdered Carmen, but that can possibly be explained by Carmen's own mother, Phyllis. Phyllis insists that Carmen was a stubborn girl who would have fought against being victimized, and likely learned of her abductor's identity. It's possible she saw who her kidnapper was, and knew who he was, and she paid the ultimate price for that. Operation Spectrum now publicly connected Carmen Chan's murder to the 3 previous sexual assault kidnappings, and laid the blame at the feet of the true culprit, the still unidentified Mr. Cruel. Operation Spectrum would last for the next few years, costing over $4 million. The 40-member task force would go on to investigate over 27,000 suspects, receive over 10,000 tips from the public, and search over 30,000 houses in the hopes of identifying a single clue. While Mr. Cruel was never identified by the task force, it went on to arrest over 70 people involved in child pornography, a seedy underworld that many believed Mr. Cruel to be involved with. Both of his freed abductees had claimed to have seen or heard clues of a video camera at the foot of the bed they had been detained in, and it was an easy step to believe that Mr. Cruel was involved in the trading of child porn. But, despite all of the good accomplished by Operation Spectrum, the Victoria police force was marred with claims of corruption in the early 1990s. Operation Spectrum was eventually shelved in 1994, and with it, any potential investigations to find out Mr. Cruel's identity. Over the years, theories would linger about the identity of Mr. Cruel and his eventual fate. No future crimes would be publicly attributed to him, but investigators have possibly tagged prior crimes on Mr. Cruel. While they believe that the abduction and murder of Carmen Chan was his last offense in the Victoria area, there are potentially up to a dozen assaults on children in the mid-1980s that have remained unsolved. And, surprisingly, almost all of them share a couple details with the Mr. Cruel abductions. So it's possible that Mr. Cruel is far more notorious of a criminal than publicly known. But police have refused to release details of these prior assaults, or Mr. Cruel's alleged ties to them. Another theory that has emerged has been Mr. Cruel's supposed ties to the Victoria school system. All 4 of the assaults and abductions happened during school breaks, which led many to believe that Mr. Cruel was an employee of the local school system. This also goes in conjecture with the knowledge that both Nicola Linus and Carmen Chan attended the same school, Presbyterian Ladies College. And Mr. Cruel requested Nicola to bring her school uniform along with her. This would bring into question his ties to Sharon Wills and the first victim, but he addressed Sharon by her first name on the night that she was abducted. It's very possible that this monster, a man that preyed on children in the most depraved ways, spent his working hours among them. In 2010, over 20 years after the original abductions and assaults, a new investigation was launched into finding out details and hopefully identifying this Australian boogeyman. Task Force Apollo was launched, hoping that newer technology and investigative methods could bring about an answer that prior detectives had failed to find. Unfortunately, much to the dismay of the task force itself, many of the case files were misfiled, unorganized, or just straight up missing. In fact, one of the vital pieces of evidence that could have led to Mr. Cruel's doorstep, a piece of tape used to bind one of the victims, was missing. Police could have potentially used that piece of tape to recover DNA from Mr. Cruel, but it had disappeared while in police custody. This missing piece of crucial evidence, paired with Mr. Cruel's tactical abilities and his knowledge of forensic evidence, has led many to theorize that he might have been involved in law enforcement. It's possible that he would know what investigators would be looking for, which is why he did his best to cleanse his victims of any DNA and remove vital evidence afterwards. We can only guess whether it was corruption or ineptitude that led to these essential parts of the case going missing. However, one suspect was detained in 2013 that ultimately could have been Mr. Cruel. Robert Keith Knight was a man who had made a living as a youth worker and a school volunteer, but he had been arrested on 2 separate occasions for a multitude of crimes against children. In 1980 and 1996, Knight had been arrested and convicted for sexual assault on minors, and a multitude of other victims had come out of the woodwork following his convictions. According to the original Operation Spectrum investigators, Robert Keith Knight was one of their suspects that had never quite panned out. but investigators had been unable to eliminate him from contention. He remained a person of interest throughout the following investigations, and the time of the Mr. Cruel assaults would coincide with his post-1980 conviction release. After being released from prison for his 1996 conviction in 2009, Knight began to amass thousands of child pornography images, and he was later detained in an investigation by Victorian police. He pled guilty due to the overwhelming evidence against him, and while awaiting trial, he leapt from a second-story prison railing to his death by suicide. He is just one of many suspects that the Victorian police force have had to this day, and they have refused to make much more information public. More recently, people have begun to theorize that Mr. Cruel himself might have resurfaced. These people think that Mr. Cruel might have been involved in the 2011 abduction of 13-year-old schoolgirl Bung Siribun, as that case remains unsolved without an end in sight. As of this moment, the Mr. Cruel case is still open, and he remains one of Australia's most wanted criminals. Alright, I have a confession to make. This was a hell of an episode to put together, so I appreciate all of you waiting for it. I had no intention to take over a month off from the podcast, but it just ended up working out that way. First, my day job became pretty hectic, then a dental issue arose, and before I knew it, it was time to go visit my family for the holidays. But thank you all so much for listening to this 6th episode of the Unresolved podcast. I can't say that enough. I love doing this podcast, I just wish that I had more hours in the day to dedicate to it. To all of the Australian fans of the podcast, I apologize if I butchered the pronunciation of your town names. You could blame it on the American school system for teaching me almost nothing about your country. In case you want to keep in touch with the podcast, you can most definitely do so in a myriad of ways. You can like us on Facebook, just search for the Unresolved Podcast, or you can follow us at Twitter, @UnresolvedP. Or if you're old school, you could send us an email at theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com. Simple enough. If you followed the podcast on social media, you would have been privy to all of my December updates, and my New Year's resolution goal, which is to put out at least 25 episodes in 2016. I would love to shoot for more, but that's the bare minimum goal that I've given myself. I'd like to consider this episode the unofficial launch of Season 2 of the podcast, so I plan on making it bigger and better in every way possible. You can also follow along with the podcast on the website, theunresolvedpodcast.com, where you'll find a transcript of the show, along with links to articles and videos I used to put the podcast together. You'll also find links to the music that serves as the backbone of the show. At least go there to check out the musical artists and show them some love. That's worth a visit by itself. But I guess that's it for this week's episode of the Unresolved Podcast. I hope you all have had a wonderful start to 2016, and I can't wait to get back at it for the next episode. I haven't decided which story I'm going to tell quite yet, but I'll try my hardest to make it a good one. Until then, stay safe, and may the Force be with you, always.